I'm Hazima Ozan, and I welcome you to a public lecture organized by Comstech on engagement in medical research to promote national health and well-being. This lecture will be delivered by our invited speaker, Professor Dr. Khalid Saeed Khan. So we are very delighted and honored to have you with us today. We will begin today with a recitation from Holy Quran.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الرحمن علم القرآن خلق الإنسان علمه البيان الشمس والقمر بحسبان والنجم والشجر يسجدان والسماء رفعها ووضع الميزان ألا تطغوا في الميزان وأقيموا الوزن بالقسط ولا تخسروا الميزان والأرض وضعها للأنام فيها فاكهة والنخل ذات الأكمام والحب ذو العصف والريحان فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان خلق الإنسان من صلصال كالفخار وخلق الجان من مارج من نار فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان رب المشرقين ورب المغربين فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان صدق الله العظيم.
Jazakallah. Now, I will invite Professor Dr. Iqbal Chaudhry, Coordinator General Comstech, to welcome and introduce our guest speaker today.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum, good morning and good afternoon also, because we have people from different time zones. Zima, how many participants online registered? 240, good. So, okay. Extremely pleased to introduce someone of very high stature, extremely accomplished scientist, researcher, healthcare professional, Professor Khalid Saeed Khan. Professor Khalid Saeed is on a very special mission to Pakistan. He is supervising a very important clinical trial, the first phase 1 clinical trial of vaccine in Pakistan, and he was in Karachi for quite some time. Then we requested him to come and visit Comstech and deliver this very important lecture. We wanted to maximize the benefit of his presence here. You see, he left Pakistan decades ago, but he remained connected to this country, because I learned that he has been visiting Pakistan very often and has many projects with several scientists of the country. Now, if I introduce Dr. Dr. Khalid Saeed Khan, in terms of his accomplishment, they're absolutely phenomenal. You know, we've been very fortunate to have someone of his stature from in our cadres, someone of achievements which are internationally recognized. For instance, he is a distinguished investigator at the University of Granada, Spain. He spent most of his life in UK, but his recent assignment is in Spain, sir, recently. He's a former editor-in-chief of British Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology, which is a very prestigious international journal. He's the founder of Core Outcomes in Women and Newborn Health Award-winning initiative. He's a very well-known, internationally known gynecologist, and he has been active in lots of different disciplines of healthcare research, including clinical trials. His H index is 70, which is parallel to lots of Nobel laureates. He has published over 400 peer-reviewed papers and supervised 25 high-degree theses. He graduated in medicine from Aga Khan University in its first health faculty cohort, higher training at McMaster University, and then he moved to academic career focusing on patient-oriented clinical research. Dr. Khalid has contributed to many trials, and meta-analysis has run 48 primary research trials, recruiting about 1 million participants, and has published 149 systematic review, collating to data of 604,115 studies with, again, very large number of participants. He's the lead author of systematic review to support evidence-based medicine, and which won BMA Medical Book Award. He's former editor of many journals. His Core Outcomes in Women and Newborn Health initiative was awarded a BMA Stratton Harper grant to help reduce research waste. Now, you can find lots of his accomplishment and contributions in many of these websites, which you would find on Comstech flyer. So let me tell you that his initiative of supporting clinical trials in Pakistan was a very important one. Clinical trials are extremely important, because if you know how to conduct clinical trials, then this is the critical step in pharmaceutical development. India has done that exactly the same manner, because they start doing clinical trial on contractual research basis. and now they develop their own vaccines and pharmaceuticals. So we're extremely grateful to you, Dr. Khalid, for your presence here, and I invite you for your presentation. Thank you. Thanks, sir.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. And to be completely frank, it is for me a great honor to be able to present my ideas to colleagues here in this room, and also to colleagues in the webinar. I noticed there are more than 70 participants, I presume from several countries. So thank you for the introduction. My objective today is to make a plea to colleagues who are attending and listening as to why research is critical in the health sector. And I think the fact that last year the whole world was hit by the coronavirus pandemic made us realize that what is written in textbooks is insufficient for dealing with what goes on in real life when a new condition arrives. Therefore, considering research as an optional extra in education is not fit for purpose education. The real education will prepare us to research a problem when it arrives and tackle it actively, because what we read in standard textbooks and websites and other materials available to us is something from the past that is not useful today. So with this brief introduction, I'd like to move to my slides. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. So the title makes it clear, why should we engage in medical research? You also see my position in the University of Granada, and underneath it, you see various editions of my book concerning systematic reviews. You'll also see that it is translated in German and Chinese. I'm also proud to announce that recently we've just had a contract to publish it, a version of it in Spanish. The top languages in the world are in the order of Chinese, Spanish, and then English. So I'm proud to see that what I have been able to publish with colleagues in this subject will now be available to researchers in a very wide range of countries across the world. This is the outline of my presentation. I'd like to talk a little bit about what is knowledge and how it is important to differentiate between what is fact and what is fake. The next, I would like to give you my personal history of how over 3 decades in my career, with every passing year, became more and more interested and engaged in creating knowledge and in translating knowledge for improving health. Then I'd like to give you my vision of what research is about. Typical thinking is that research is something that helps you in the future when the results are known. And I think this is true. But I think in medicine, what is interesting to think about is, does it actually help during the course of the research? Do people who take part in research themselves benefit from being part of an activity that in many fields is described as an experiment? So with this background, I would then like to move on to summarize on where we think we should be heading, considering what we have experienced across the globe, in all countries, rich, poor, with the coronavirus pandemic. I highlight here also an overview of how economic development and health coverage are linked to each other. I think it's important to recognize that the way out of problems related to health is seen as something that is correlated with economic development. But I believe it is possible for countries in the low middle income sector to catapult into improved health through investment in research. If you think about it, people say investment in research is expensive. But try dealing with this problem using ignorance. It will be even more expensive. Therefore, the need for investment in research is far more important for countries like ours in Pakistan than necessarily for countries that have already reached a particular level of economic development. So, what is the difference between belief and knowledge? Well, I think belief is something that allows us to act. When we believe that something is good, then we can do that good thing to other people as a healthcare provider. And when we believe that something is bad, then perhaps we will withhold that thing and prevent somebody from suffering harm. But is it necessary that every belief is underpinned by correct knowledge? It is possible that some beliefs are underpinned by incorrect knowledge. So they are false beliefs in some idea. So the relationship between correct knowledge and belief is an important territory or space in which scientists work. The knowledge we create allows us to confirm previously held beliefs, but the knowledge can also refute previously held beliefs. And of course, it can also create new beliefs. So we're going to look at some items from history concerning this tension between belief and its underpinning by correct knowledge. So taking this idea forward, on the one hand, we can make well-informed decisions if our belief is underpinned by correct knowledge. If our belief is not strongly held, we are unsure whether we are on the right track or not. Such knowledge is more or less the same as ignorance, because it does not equip us with the power to act. On the other hand, this is the most dangerous form of belief, where we believe something to be right, but in fact, it is wrong. We just don't know that it is wrong, perhaps because we have not interrogated the scientific literature, or perhaps the scientific literature does not exist to back that notion or belief. In this case, the belief is dangerous because it gives us the power or permission to act, but an act based on incorrect knowledge is likely to be misinformed and is likely to lead to harm. So the responsibility lies on scientists to continuously endeavor to create knowledge that challenges this type of belief so that it can be corrected. We'll take a couple of examples from history, more or less in the view that we can confirm for ourselves for today's presentation that beliefs held without correct knowledge potentially are quite dangerous. So here are two images from history. The one to your left is the one to your right is related to this diagram that I show from a microbiology laboratory. And I think you'll be able to see that it represents a hand, and it shows all the infectious organisms that are present on our hands. And I think in today's world, given what happened last year, we are all aware that keeping our hands disinfected is an important intervention for the problem we face today. So we're going to talk about this in respect of knowledge belief in historical terms. This other individual is Galileo. His history relates to the fact that for centuries it was believed that the earth is the center of the universe and the sun revolved around the earth. Today, I think almost nobody believes this. But this was a strongly held belief some centuries ago. So in the 1600s, his experiments using the telescopes that he was able to develop, he was able to challenge that belief. Challenging belief is a dangerous thing for a scientist. It requires courage. In fact, what happened was that because the strongly held belief was underpinned by the religious thinking at the time, he was incarcerated, and then I think many of us know his outcome as an individual was not good, but he continued to strongly believe in what he discovered as a scientist. He did not change his opinion on the basis of it. It took more than 300 years for the Catholic Church to finally accept officially that in fact Earth is not the center of the universe. So the idea here that I wish to highlight is that changing beliefs is a hard task, and as scientists we must stay close to the validity of our science in order to challenge the beliefs that exist. Eventually we will win, perhaps not in our lifetimes, but with time the truth will prevail. We look at this history of the hand that I showed you with the individual whose name is Semmelweis. In fact, this individual's statue is at the entrance of the World Health Organization's main door. And the image you see here, I had the privilege to take myself when I visited there some years ago. And during his time, the belief was that infection occurred due to bad air. We did not know about the existence of germs. He observed, he was a physician, and he observed that in the healthcare service where doctors provided services to women giving birth, there was a difference in mortality compared to the healthcare service where midwives and nurses provided care to women giving birth. And he observed this difference in rates over several years. We are talking about 150 years ago. It's not a very long time ago. Can you guess which of these graphs relate to doctors and which relates to nurses and midwives? Well, the higher mortality was in the doctors' service, and the lower mortality was in the nursing midwifery service. You would expect the opposite, but this is what he observed. So he made him think, what is going on? And because we did not know about existence of germs, he examined what were the behaviors or practices of the practitioners. And he noticed that the doctors were performing dissections of dead bodies for their own education, just next to the clinical service area where women were giving birth. And there was no culture of hand washing, in part because microbiology and infectious disease science was not as well developed. So he thought, if I give a lime juice water solution to ask doctors to wash their hands, might that affect the mortality? So you can think of this as a scientific experiment, right? So he offered this lime juice water solution, and guess what? As doctors use this solution to wash their hands, the mortality rate in their service fell down to the same level as that in the service delivered by nurses and midwives. For making this discovery, you would have thought that he would be praised. But because he was challenging a belief without necessarily being able to explain, microscopes did not exist in the way that they exist today. He was in fact incarcerated in a psychiatric hospital where he died, spent the rest of his life and died there. Well, after his death, of course, this is his thesis. After his death, he has been rewarded by his statue being present at the World Health Organization and various commemorative stamps and coins with his image embossed on them. I presume any colleague whose microphone is on at home, please could you switch that off? So with that background, I'd like to say a few things about research translation. This is a term very commonly used in medical research. For colleagues who are in other disciplines, hopefully this will help contextualize what I'm going to say later. So I think of science as that relating to, with respect to medicine, as that relating to cellular, subcellular levels, at organ level in the human body, and we can call this laboratory science. And we can also have science that studies patients and societies, and we can call this patient-centered research. The idea is that lab research should ultimately lead to health impact. And this is what, in general, we are discussing today. The journey from lab science to health impact, I guess, is what I, for the purpose of today's presentation, would like to call research translation. And this journey is not a straight line. It is a convoluted path where you can sometimes move a couple of steps forward, then a step back, then a couple of steps forward. And this is the typical journey in any subject. In the translation zone, the terms used are clinical efficacy research. This involves humans. And then clinical effectiveness research. This also involves humans. Clinical efficacy research tends to be in small number of subjects, and effectiveness research tends to be in very large number of subjects. often in many centers, sometimes across many countries. And in fact, I wish to emphasize this type of research because Comstech is a specially placed organization that can in fact use its network of tens of countries to allow for us to invest in effectiveness research. And you will be able to see as we go through the course of the presentation today that it is effectiveness research that allows us to make a leap forward into health impact. Because until effectiveness research is completed, we remain in a little bit of a gray zone. We do not know what we can do. At the end of effectiveness research, we can be confident about what we can do. The transition from efficacy to effectiveness research tends to be described in the literature as T2 translation. Well, you'll ask me, what is T1? Well, T1 is the research carried out at stages earlier than humans, could be in animals or tissues and cells in the laboratory setting. So T1 is the translation from that level to the first in human. After effectiveness research, we have what we call evidence synthesis. And evidence synthesis is the subject concerning which I, in my first slide, showed you some images of my book concerning systematic reviews. So systematic review and evidence synthesis, this phase is called T3 translation. And after evidence synthesis is something called guideline implementation. This is called T4 translation. The point here is that at the end of effectiveness research, there is still more to be done before health impact can be achieved. If you wish to think about all of this in the context of what pharmaceutical industry and research related to chemicals, the terminology used in that setting, then phase 1 research, phase 2 research, and phase 3 research, these relate up to the level of T2 translation. A typical phase 2 study will have normally around 100 or so subjects. They may or may not be healthy volunteers. Phase 3 will be typically in patients and will be the multi-center study which I described as the clinical effectiveness research. And phase 4 is something that happens following the T4 step when we have introduced an intervention in practice and we wish to continually keep an eye on what happens when we intervene. So for example, once vaccination is brought into Pakistan and applied widely across the population, we would want to know what is the result of the vaccination across our country, and that will be phase 4. I am proud to say that the task force that was set up by the government concerning coronavirus research in March last year has allowed Pakistan to engage in these various phases and translation. And I'm going to give you a brief overview of my role that I was able to play during the course of the presentation, rest of the presentation. So having said a little bit about fact and how facts are created through research and what is the process of how these things need to address beliefs, change those beliefs, change practice, it's in that order that eventually we will ultimately achieve health impact. Here I present a slide concerning countries where 20 countries where nearly 80% of all of maternal and infant death occurs. And you can see that Pakistan is in one of those geographical patches. where there is this high level of mortality. I think if we map on top of this comstech geography, there will be quite a lot of overlap. So we have a challenge right for scientists to address. And I would like to show a little bit about how I, who started my life in a medical school wanting to be a doctor, made my own transition from being a clinician to being a full-time researcher, and what influenced my thought process. So I started, as kindly indicated by Professor Iqbal, medical school in Karachi at Aga Khan University. This was 1983. After graduation, I moved to work in Kenya, which is where I got interested in women's health. In fact, I performed my first cesarean section in that hospital, which you see here. I then returned to Pakistan, completed my fellowship here at the College of Physicians and Surgeons, and my residency completed at Aga Khan University. And during this time, I became curious about the effectiveness of interventions I and my other colleagues were offering to patients. I give you one example. We typically used to study in textbooks and teach our students that antenatal care, which is looking after women before they give birth during pregnancy, helps to prevent maternal mortality. But actually, it was only through research that I discovered that providing safe blood transfusion service and a rapid responsive ambulance service were far more important than antenatal care. So the absence of incorporation of research findings in the curriculum, in fact, were leading me and other colleagues, all of us well-meaning doctors, to emphasize the wrong stuff in our education. So this kind of background encouraged me to think about, can I learn about research? And this encouraged me to apply for various fellowships, and I was able to obtain one that allowed me to study about epidemiology at McMaster University in Canada, where I did a master's degree. I returned from there halfway across to the UK, where I then spent 25 years of my life. In the UK, I worked in various roles. For 5 years in Birmingham, I was a professor in women's health, and then for 10 years at Barts and the London Medical School at Queen Mary University of London. During this time, I also invested effort in and qualification in education to discover how I can best teach about research and bring this into education. And a lot of my publications happened during this period. But about 15 years ago, I had the opportunity to visit a city in English called Granada, in Urdu, Garnata. I think we have all, in history lessons, read about the Muslim rule in Andalusia, where Granada was the capital city. And I guess in part influenced by the fascination of history, I fell in love with the city. It has a 500-year-old university. The first building of the university, called Madrasa, is still preserved as it is and is a place for public lectures given by a university concerning various topics of interest to the public in a language that can be understood by the public. And I got the opportunity to move there this year, and I just jumped on that opportunity. The plane I took to land in Granada from London happened to be the last plane that left London for Granada, because the next day Spain went into quarantine, and the next week the UK went into quarantine, and people's movements were restricted because all the planes just landed in their hangars. Guess what? None of us had experienced this in our lives. I think a unique situation for which nobody is prepared. Certainly, medical workforce in most countries is totally unprepared for this type of situation, in part because research is nothing other than a few hours of highlight, no detail, no understanding concerning what is its relevance to the challenges we face in healthcare. In a few days after being in the quarantine in Granada, I received an invitation, a phone call from Pakistan. This was 21st of March. I was surprised because I had left the country 25 years ago. I never lived here as a citizen during these 25 years. Of course, I visited and had contacts. But to receive a call inviting me to engage in coronavirus-related research that was proposed we should invest in was for me a visionary idea, because Pakistan so far had not had the peak. It was just the beginning of the pandemic as far as Pakistan was concerned. So here, scientists like Professor Iqbal and Atta and others were already of the mindset that we are going to throw science at this problem ahead of its peak. Having just moved from the UK to Granada, for me, I was completely bewildered, because in the UK, the day I took the flight to Granada, the government was still talking about herd immunity will cure this problem. They were not talking about how we are going to restrict movements, how we are going to recommend masks. They were simply talking about this is going to go ahead and herd immunity will cure it. I accepted this invitation. I'm going to say more about this in a few more slides. But I'm grateful to the news that published my experience of having entered the scientific task force on corona, which they did in May. I'm sorry if I take you again through my journey, but I think it's important because for medics particularly to think about how science is put into practice is not a natural process. So in 1990, when I was in Kenya, at that time I had undertaken some work which in today's language will be described as audit, not necessarily research. But we are talking about 30 years ago. Data like that could be written up and published. And I had the privilege of having my first article published in a British journal. Interestingly, it's also one of my few articles that got published after the first submission. Normally, the experience is several rejections and revisions before acceptance. In fact, I have never experienced acceptance without rejection and revision other than this first time. So it was, I guess, first time lucky. This must also have been something that motivated me to go further in this direction. I got interested in systematic reviews during my epidemiology training, and my first systematic review was published about 25 years ago. During my 25 years in the UK, I had a chance to edit these various journals, write this book, and for 6 years I was chief editor of the British Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology. In 2020, when I moved to Granada, there had been over 30,000 citations to my 400 plus articles, and I had the privilege and honor to present why science is important in medicine in these 37 countries across the globe that I highlight in this map. And here is an overview of all my articles. And the key thing I wish to highlight here is that for me, the 400 plus number is not important. For me, the names of the journals and their impact factor where it's published is not important. The co-authors and institutions who co-published with me is not important. The most important thing is this orange line that you observe. This is actually the numbers of patients that have contributed data to my publications. And this number is in millions, as Professor Iqbal highlighted. They entered into research on a voluntary basis, more or less to donate their data. And this is an act of altruism, because when we invite them to take part in research, we do not give them some personal benefit that will arise to them from it. So they are in effect making a little sacrifice of their time and the effort they will make in the course of the study in order to benefit future generations, people in the future, once the research is completed and published. So I thank all of them, because without their contribution, my publications would not happen, and the impact that my publications have had in healthcare would not happen. During the last years, it also made me think about, well, these people are making all these sacrifices. Is there any benefit that accrues to them personally by taking part in research? So I'm going to address that in just a moment. And for me, so far, I think the most dramatic event that has affected me was the move to Granada and immediately entering into quarantine. I was hoping to enter the doors of a university in a department where I will engage with students and colleagues to start new research projects. And here I was locked up inside my new flat that I purchased for my move to Granada. But the thing that was the most positive in that time was that call on the 21st of March that put me on this list, the government's notification of the task force. And this was announced on the 24th of March. So before I move on, I'd like to give you an example of what is clinical effectiveness research, so we can put in context what I'm talking about and what I'm going to say more in the rest of this presentation. So during a cesarean section, because it's an operation to help a woman give birth to a child, some blood is lost. Typically, this blood is collected in a bucket and thrown away safely, but there is no other more polite way of describing what happens to this lost blood. We thought about the idea of whether can this blood be collected filtered, and given back to the person having the cesarean section in order to see if it's possible to improve their health. Their own body product that is essential for life, if it's not thrown away and given back to them, could it be beneficial? So this is a kind of question that clinical effectiveness research in my field addresses. To address this type of research, here is a picture of how the blood is collected and filtered to give it back to the mother. To address this type of research, here is a filter equipment and the collected blood being prepared to be given back. But to undertake this type of research, here is a map of the UK with over 20 centers that are taking part. There are over 3,000 women who provide their consent and voluntarily take part in this study. And it takes nearly 3 years to complete recruitment. And here is a graph of how recruitment goes up and down. And every time the recruitment in studies goes down, the heartbeat of the researcher goes up a bit because they become anxious. So we're talking about thousands of patients, multiple centers, tens of centers, and 3 years of effort. But if you imagine an organization like comstech can achieve, well, we are talking about tens of thousands of sections happening daily across a country like Pakistan. And if all the comstech country take part, in fact, these 3,000 cesarean sections can be, the recruitment of 3,000 women in such a study can be achieved, if not in days, then within weeks. So to be responsive to a challenge, we have no time to wait. When the pandemic arrives, we need to be ready to invite tens of thousands of people to take part in studies that will generate the information with which we will make health policy and improve health outcomes. So for this readiness, I request you all and the leaders at comstech to think about how we should go forward to invest in development of this type of infrastructure to allow multiple thousands of patients from several countries to be rapidly invited to take part in studies. In this case, around 3,000 were required. And on publication, the results demonstrated that when the cesarean is carried out as an emergency, the collection, filtering, and giving back of blood is helpful. But perhaps in other circumstances, when there isn't an emergency, it is not that helpful. So these answers help us to decide what to do next. They are not just ideas for including 2 additional lines in the CV of the co-authors. This information changes beliefs about what we should do, and it is impactful. Here we see high-income countries staying static at the percentage of articles per population. The low-income countries also staying static, but at a low level, and the middle-income countries on an upward projection. And I think this investment is really important for health impact. I'll come back to address this in a second. But first, we look at the relationship between research, the impact it has in the future, and the impact it has in the present among the participants who are taking part. So if we think about a vaccine trial, we are talking about what, 10, 20, 30,000 people taking part. Do these 10, 20, 30,000 people taking part benefit? Of course, when these 30,000 people, their data are analyzed and published, then organizations like DRAP and the ministries of health will use these findings to benefit the public at large. But will these 30,000 people benefit? That's my question. I'd like to address this with you in the next set of slides. So the first thing is, here is a guidance for the rules under which medical practice should take place. One of the rules is, in the UK, according to the UK General Medical Council, one of the rules is that that health workers should act in a way that helps to resolve uncertainty about effects of treatments. This line is interpreted in many different ways. One of the most important interpretations that I apply to this statement is that taking part in research is not an optional extra. It is an essential requirement for medical practitioners, because without it, uncertainty about effect of treatment cannot be reduced. The public is taking an interest in research. Here is an article published in The Guardian in the UK. When patients are invited to take part in a manner that is ethical, that is regulated, that involves patients' consent, that has respect for those who participate, that maximizes the benefit and minimizes the harm to those who participate, and that is based on proper planning so that the research undertaken is justifiable. And the invitations given for research are according to competence of people who are going to take part. Then I think in this situation, we have the right platform with which we can engage with the public directly with respect to research. So here is an image of people, and here is an invitation to people written in Urdu, advertised publicly in a hospital at the entrance and at the back of an ambulance, inviting people to take part in a study. This is one of those projects that the Scientific Task Force in Pakistan concerning coronavirus started. And there are many others like this. So the people who took part in these projects, did they benefit? Of course, the country will benefit in a few weeks and months as soon as the vaccine arrives. But what happened in the past as these people were taking part in research? So the typical idea is demonstrated by this slide. After the Second World War, mortality in breast cancer is rising decade after decade, as you can see. This is at a time when countries are becoming richer, people are becoming more educated, social development is happening all across the world. There are no wars, or if there are any, they are limited and small. But despite all this development, the mortality is rising. At the same time, people are taking part in research. And by the end of the 80s, 61 trials have been completed, and nearly 30,000 women have taken part in breast cancer trials. It is only after this that the mortality began to come down. And this type of evidence is repeated condition after condition, treatment after treatment. So to believe that future will be brighter after research is completed is, I think, a common belief. The question for me was, do the people who enter in studies now, these people, will they, or those who have in the past taken part, have they accrued any benefit by being part of research? In other words, does research help in the present at the time when it is ongoing? So I invite you to think about various questions that I put up in this slide. We see here two situations. In one, on your right, people turn up to the hospital and they just receive standard care. And to your left, the same people similar to them, enter in another hospital, but over there, they are randomized. A third of them receive, for example, standard care or placebo, and 2/3 of them receive a new intervention, for example, a vaccine under trial. This is something that happened not a million miles away from right here, Shifa Hospital, very near to here. I think you can drive there within 10 or 15 minutes. Took part in a study like this. And in fact, is the center that has recruited the largest number of patients in any center taking part in this study, for more than 5,500. This is an exceptional number. The team that took part, that led this study, I think deserves congratulations, like others do too, but especially to them for having such large numbers taking part. Do these people who took part benefit compared to others not in the study? This is the question we want to look at. If you think about it, the people who are not in the study, they are not being cared for or looked after under any regulatory framework. So those who are in the study, they will be followed up according to a protocol. The protocol is ethically approved. The people taking, the investigators in the study will invite these people to come back for checks or keep an eye on their well-being during the course of the study. If any side effects are observed, then these will be reported to an independent committee. They will examine whether it is safe to continue the trial. These things that happen to those who took part, do they actually happen on the other side where standard care is provided? It's a question to think about. Probably not. Probably not. I think the answer to this question, do people in this study receive more frequent personal monitoring? Well, more likely, because in standard care, we do not necessarily have the resources or protocols with which to keep an eye on what is going on. Care according to protocol is an essential feature of research. Well, perhaps in standard side, there could be some flexibility and some element of haphazardness. Well, do clinicians who take part in research consider themselves better or worse than those who don't? This is an open question. Won't go into detail just now, but should this be raised for future discussion after I stop talking, I'll be happy to comment on that. In the trials, in the trial group, the chance that people receive a new intervention is higher, because in the standard side, perhaps even the new intervention is not available. And finally, the question of whether this trial, the people who took part in the trial, will they have better health outcome than those who were not inside the trial? The answer to this question, in our team, we undertook what we call a meta-analysis that arises from a systematic review. To cut a long story short, this diagram shows over 20 studies from which it was possible to evaluate the difference in outcome between those who took part in a trial and compare it with the outcomes of those who were not inside a trial or a study. In this result, we see that no appreciable difference can be demonstrated at a statistical level. In this other study, we can see that benefit is demonstrated to non-participants or to people who are outside the trial. And in this other example study, there is a benefit to participants. And when we combine all of these results together in a single analysis, it transpires that there is a 25% benefit of being part of a study. So I invite you to reevaluate the thinking about who benefits from research. It is not just future patients. It's also people today who are taking part in research. They benefit themselves. And with this idea, our group has in London published several articles inviting clinicians to consider this idea and incorporate research as an integral part of their practice. Now, here is a 2018 analysis of research output in low middle income countries. I am proud here to say that Pakistan stands at the top. These figures are from 2017, 2018. This type of trajectory needs to continue in our country in order for us to benefit people who take part in research as well as future. I'll give you a breakdown of this analysis based on current evaluation in Nature Index. We are talking about research in various different fields, but life sciences, which is in orange or yellow, is a small component. So I think Comstech has a role to play in encouraging life sciences research, and health research is part of that life sciences research. So while we have success in chemistry and physics, please also target life sciences as a priority area for promotion. Here is an outline of how long it takes to create a scientist. I think researcher creation pathway is too long for us to wait. Today, we cannot say, let us wait 10 years till the first PhD doctors appear to allow us to do health research. We need to do research today. This research will create the knowledge which will eventually be transferred as benefits to future patients. But knowledge creation must be incorporated in routine care in every hospital, in every clinic, in every public health service, in Pakistan and across Comstech countries, because this is what will allow people to benefit as a result of being part of research. I remind you again of the formula I presented in relation to research translation zone earlier. And I remind you again of the outline with respect to pharmacology, various phases of drug trials or drug development. These are the various types of studies. And here I emphasize again that these multi-center, these large trials, they need organizations like Comstech. They need invitations for people to participate from various countries, using platform that is adaptable across the infrastructures that exist in different settings, using various languages, something that is centralized and uses the IT revolution that is occurring now and is visible to all of us more today than it was this time last year, because the coronavirus forced us to use the IT infrastructure to maximize its potential. So this is the type of research that changes things. How do we do this type of research? The patients are at the center of this research. The health service around it allows for the invitations to be sent to the patients to take part. and partnerships like Comstech around the health service provide the academic input, the trials unit that is necessary, the projects and the questions that are important for this, and the ethics and regulatory framework, and the clinical networks, and the partnerships with industry. And this also gives the environment in which training can take place. So the training is not in a theoretical basis inside a classroom. It is in the shop floor where research is in fact happening, where people are being invited, where people are being consented to take part in research. And most important of all, we also need to engage patients and the public. Is this possible? When I moved to London, it was an invitation to commence what I just described in a part of East London where before my arrival, there was no women's health study taking place. And within a few years of arrival, it was possible, for example, you can see in the last year, more than 15 studies running and nearly 1,000 patients taking part. So it is possible to achieve this. I think Pakistan itself has shown the way forward. I present to you the announcement made on the 24th of May last year concerning the task force. And you see the list of names in the task force concerning coronavirus research, chaired by Professor Atta. It took us a few months to hold all the various discussions and negotiations. And in August, we had the approval to start the COVID vaccine trial. Just a few days ago, there is an announcement in Dawn that the Chinese vaccine registration can follow because the trials we commenced are completed. So I think the members of the committee who took this forward and the colleagues who make this happen at the shop floor, the regulatory bodies who evaluated and permitted this to occur, I think all deserve congratulations. Through these studies, thousands of people in Pakistan have already been vaccinated. Of course, some have received placebo, but don't forget that thousands of people have already been vaccinated in Pakistan. Through the effort at Shifa Hospital, today it is possible to say that nearly 3,000 people have been vaccinated around this site. This is ahead of DRAP approval for bringing the vaccine to the country. Research allowed for this to happen. Without research, these vaccinations would not have occurred. People and their families have actually benefited by taking part in research. This is the message I'd like to leave with all of you. It is, in my opinion, an ethical requirement for researchers related to life sciences and healthcare to actively push the research agenda. Organizations like Comstech can facilitate this. Based on what I have presented, I hope you will agree that research has improved outcomes in the last months in Pakistan and other countries that have taken part in trials. So research is not just for the future, it is for the present. And I believe it is obligatory, essential, not an optional extra, that healthcare must happen with the provision inside it as an integral part of of participation in health research opportunities. So with that, I bring my presentation to close. Thank you very much for listening. I'm very happy to take any questions, and I would appreciate comments. Yes, please. Will we be using any microphone for the?
Probably I can hear me. My name is Prasida and I'm an advisor at comstech. Thank you for a very amazing lecture. I was just curious about the quality and the extent of medical research in Pakistan. I noticed the numbers that you showed about the increase in the numbers of publications that you know there's a hot debate in Pakistan about the meaningfulness of numbers as such. What does it take? Yeah. But I know about my own field, physics, mathematics, there are issues. But how about the field of medicine and health? What is the quality of medical research in Pakistan, and is it really contributing to public health?
Okay. So, look, my personal experience of research in Pakistan is limited to the last months. And I would say that what I have observed in the regulatory process with respect to National Bioethics Committee, the drug regulatory framework, well, the infrastructure at the top level exists. But at the ground, in fact, many hospitals do not have regulatory approval to conduct studies. In fact, many hospitals don't even have research bioethics committees. So there is a massive journey in these sites. But the hospitals like Shifa, like Indus in Karachi, like University of Health Sciences in Lahore, and their 20 other partner hospitals, they have shown that it is possible, where nothing existed, to create something. And the fact that in fact thousands of patients have taken part rapidly means that when there is motivation, then progress can occur. I think your second question relates, the second part of your question relates to what is the quality of this research? Can we believe the results when they appear? Well, this is an open question. I think as research develops in Pakistan, this type of a question will need to be addressed. The regulatory framework would need to examine, first of all, that there is no coercion. People are in fact entering voluntarily. And there is no data manipulation, so what is reported is true, and that the research that is being planned is of high quality. But I am optimistic and I am not pessimistic. What I've observed in the last months has given me lots of personal motivation that it's possible to move ahead. Thank you for your comment.
Thank you very much for a very fascinating talk. My name is Hassan Abazai, and I'm a core-team member of the team which is implementing the phase 3 clinical trials in Pakistan. My question to you is that I was very pleased to hear that the government has formed a national task force on research and can you share with us the outcome of this task force, and especially if someone has looked into the reasons, how the pandemic has unfolded in Pakistan and why we have not had such devastating impact, which was projected, and we are spared, the impact that has been especially witnessed.
Thank you. Is Professor Iqbal available? Can I ask?
He's in a meeting.
Okay. Well, I was turning to him not because I want to escape this question. It's because my answer to you is going to be limited to my personal impression. And I think your question is broader. And for the broader answer, I think Professor Iqbal is much better placed than I am. So if he does not arrive before our session ends, perhaps if there is a coffee break afterwards, he could answer. With respect to why our figures appear more healthy than, for example, in the UK, where it's like a complete disaster, I would make some observations, and I would not say these are facts, these are hypotheses. our life expectancy is lower, and the highest risk group that suffers severely from this problem is the older age group. It is possible that because of how the demographics are with respect to age in our country, we are, put it in a positive way, protected. But this does not mean that health and economic development does not have a challenge in this country. We, of course, want to do things that will increase the life expectancy in the future. So this, I think, our demographic shape of the age distribution is possibly a protective factor. Another, may I dare hypothesize, it is possible that we don't have all the systems in place to make the detailed measurements. So the picture we receive when measured is perhaps not a complete picture. And I think this should encourage us to think about how we can create the complete picture in the years to come, because I don't think the pandemic is going away anytime soon. The challenges that we face today are different from the ones that we faced in May last year. But in May this year, the challenges will be different. And the better our data collection and measurement system, the more informed decisions we can make. So this, I think, is my best guess to the question you raised. And I hope other colleagues who are more knowledgeable than me can also comment on this question that you raised. Thank you.
The point where we need this. I said, here is the point where we need this.
That is correct. Research will help address your question in the coming months and years. Yes. There is a, I'm sorry, can the lady at the back go ahead first before you? Please go ahead.
So this is the research why or
so let me see if I understand your question. Your question is, why are people turning up to Shifa and not to other hospitals?
not in Shifa and not in other parts of the country.
Okay. All right. Okay. Well, look, research in healthcare of this type need to happen in a site that has regulatory approval. To get regulatory approval, the site need to have an ethics committee. It need to have the equivalent of an institutional review and monitoring board. It needs to have other things that are essential to keep the interventional product safe and at the correct circumstances, so they do not lose their viability. A system that allows them to collect data in a manner that its integrity is maintained, and a system that permits for people to enter and offer their consent voluntarily. These type of sites, I understand, are few and far between in Pakistan. There is a need to have more of these sites. So I hope in a few years, if I return to make a presentation, Shifa wouldn't be the only site, and there will be many more sites in Islamabad. Please, if the comment relates to the same, please go ahead.
Question. It's not really true, the impression that only volunteers are turning up at Shifa. In fact, there were 5 research centers. Shifa was the first one to be opened in Islamabad, where it was followed by University of Health Sciences and Lahore, and then finally Al University and Indus Hospital. So Shifa got a 2-month head start compared to Karachi, and Lahore was 1 month behind Shifa. But in the end, we have completed about 5,500 Shifa, 5,000 UHs, and other places. But in the beginning, we struggled with recruitment of volunteers. But with the passage of time, we engaged on the social media, electronic media, and at the same time around November, when the second wave, so-called second wave update or came into being, our work became easier. People were by then much more sensitized and willing to listen to our views.
Well, so thank you very much for this explanation. Maybe you could pass the microphone in front, because you've been.
Thank you so much. Very good presentation, Dr. Akbar. You gave the research framework, especially in the medical sciences. As you also indicated in your presentation, that the research that we do in the medical sciences should have an impact. So I was wondering, we have seen that sometimes the research usually lies in the research paper that we usually are all mostly after an impact in the terms of impact factors, things like that. But in your opinion, what responsibilities that are there that lies on the medical researchers so that they can communicate their research with the public as well as with the policymakers and legislators, for example, in the form of policy brief or research brief or writing a blog for the public, so that the general public can also get a gist out of the whole research. Can you elaborate on that? And I'm sorry I missed my introduction. I'm Dr. Usman Zahir. I'm the Surveillance Lead for Antimicrobial Resistance in Animal Health Sector through the Planning 2020 grant of the UK government.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Well, your question has many facets. Well, your question, I believe, is one of the most important questions facing health research at the moment. The idea is, I think, to put in other words, in my own words, how can we speed up the transfer of information on completion of research to putting it into action? Historically, people say in medicine it takes nearly a decade for this to happen. Well, this luxury does not exist in problems like coronavirus. There are many solutions proposed, and one in which I have my own experience is that at the time of planning and running the study, we should engage patient representatives or public representatives. Another way, involve citizens in our science formally, officially, not casually. We get them to be part of trial management group. We get them to be part of trial steering committee. We get them to be part of data monitoring committee. They can express their opinions. They can learn from what we are discussing. With this, they will be empowered, and they will then be ready to use the results on the day they are reported after peer review to disseminate it through their own networks. And the social media provides a fantastic platform for disseminating correct information. Of course, frequently it is used for disseminating incorrect information, but if we use it correctly, then those benefits that you highlight are a challenge can be achieved. Another area of, I believe, intervention on behalf of colleagues sitting in the audience is to make publicly available on a register what research is ongoing. At the moment, if I want to find out, are there any trials going on in Pakistan? There is actually no publicly available register. The WHO says that each country should have its register. I would suggest that this is an area that perhaps somebody in the audience in the relevant section can look at, because to set this up is possible immediately. To set up a website where people report what they are doing so that the ministries and the relevant departments can be alerted to and anticipate when the results will become available. When we ask people to report what they are doing, we can also ask them their expected completion date. And if that is publicly available, that will facilitate the process. Another reason why this is really important for Pakistan, and perhaps also for many other comstech countries, is that in medical journals, the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors has decided that registration of a trial publicly ahead of starting the trial is an essential requirement for publication. So if such a provision does not exist in Pakistan, our researchers and research loses the opportunity to get published in high impact journals. So for these two reasons, I summarize my answer with two suggestions. One of engaging citizens in science formally and early in research. And the second is to create this register, which through the power of internet can make available information about what research is ongoing at this time. Thank you. We can take questions from anybody. Please go ahead. Please could you introduce yourself?
Yes, Professor Dr. N. M. Bhatt, a physicist, nuclear physicist. These days I'm interested in nanomedicine. My question is, I'm very appreciative of your research propagation, but I suggest that at the education level of MBBS, if one semester is allocated to research of the students, the professors there would be involved, and in future, I think these people will have interest in continuing their research later on. What is your opinion about it? Thank you.
Well, thank you for this comment. I would suggest that we should even go one step further. So let me see how I can give a little bit of a preamble to my answer. In many medical rotations, some practical activity is considered compulsory. For example, in gynecology, the curriculum may have made it obligatory that you should have observed 5 or 10 deliveries or births. And without having made these observations, you cannot pass your rotation. I think a course like MBBS can make it obligatory that you must have consented 10 or 15 patients into a trial, and without this experience, you cannot get your MBBS degree. Something on these lines will in fact prepare people, the students, but also the institutions that offer education to set up the system that will allow for studies to be embedded in education and practice.
I think that's good for practical information, but I'm talking into research and later on get the taste of research itself. Getting this information of some patients, etc., is useful, it's practical. But research is something which as a career one has to adapt and adopt, sort of get the insight into it and interest into it at a younger age. That's what we learned some 60 years ago from Government College Lahore, when nuclear science was being taught by Professor Rafi M. Chaudhry. There was 1 year of research in the final year, and that I think several of us got interested in research later on. Thank you. I'm just talking of the dedicated research during the course of the studies at an early age. Thank you.
Well, I totally agree with you. The balance between theory and practice in the curriculum must be right. I remind myself during your comment that I started by saying that the current curriculum is unfit for dealing with a problem like a pandemic. So the solution is to embed research in not just in one trimester, but throughout the 5 years. And the theory of how research is planned, how hypothesis is developed, how sample size is calculated, these specific activities need to be balanced with the practical aspect of, in fact, obtaining consent from a patient, or collecting data, or examining their outcomes as part of a study. The two things go hand in hand. Simply knowing the theory about sample size calculation without a site available with drug regulatory approval for conducting study will not deliver what is required. In my experience, the biggest obstacle to conducting research is not the inability to plan a research protocol, but is the opposition of my own colleagues to take part in research. The changing of the mindset of clinical colleagues that in fact voluntary participation during the provision of care is possible and visible is what will facilitate or oil the machinery that is necessary for delivering large number of patients into clinical trials.
Şafula. Poklayamayın. Dike vykručitelete.
Okay. So with this, I hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you.